Venezuela's president wins a new term in the face of international condemnation. But can Nicolas Maduro use his next 6 years to salvage the country's economy? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmaker is the Venezuelan election. Nicolas Maduro says he's not going anywhere after winning what he calls a truly popular victory in an impeccable electoral process. The election board's figures give the protege of the late Hugo Chavez 67.7% of the vote, a far greater majority than 5 years ago when he barely scraped past 50%. The president's main rival, Henry Falcón, says widespread vote buying and other irregularities mean the result is illegitimate. Other critics, such as the banned opposition leader Enrique Capriles, have called for free and fair elections. While nearly a third of the country doesn't trust Maduro, what everyone wants is for him to regenerate the poverty-stricken economy. Sandra Gatman reports from Caracas.
Tengo el pelo completamente blanco. Voy a sacar juventud de mi pasado.
Hugo Padrón is one of millions of Venezuelans struggling to survive in a country where the cost of living has become outrageous.
Que con los reales que me da las prestaciones, o sea, lo que están dando, no llega, no puedo comprar los remedios. Un remedio vale $1,000,000 y pico. La señora Miela y una CB. Ahorita, hace rato estaba caminando por ahí para comprar una panelita de jabón de las llaves. Y por ahí consiguen, buscando, valen 400.000 bolívares. Dígame usted, que es como una quincena que cobro yo por sanidad.
But neither Hugo nor his friends were interested in voting.
La pena o no votar para que gane lo que está montado todavía.
With an abstention rate of at least 55%, this was the most unpopular presidential election in Venezuela's history. Compared to other years, this voting center in a Caracas slum wasn't busy. Even a government militiaman told us the numbers were low. Just outside, loyalists of Nicolas Maduro tried to boost the turnout, offering free health checkups and a cash prize to government-issued ID card holders after they'd voted. A blatant attempt at bribing voters, according to the opposition. Maduro used every muscle to guarantee a second term, even deploying a dancing Maradona at his final rally.
There are thousands of people here, and as far as we could see, most of them were bussed in from all over Venezuela.
With Venezuela's economy collapsing under his watch, the incumbent president promised a turnaround.
Les juro que voy a encabezar los grandes cambios económicos y voy a hacer una revolución económica que sacudirá al mundo entero.
Esa es una guerra económica que lo tiene el imperio norteamericano porque se nos quiere quitar nuestra riqueza.
No hay ni comida ni medicina y deseamos y esperamos que con este cambio haya todo en los anaceles y en los hospitales.
¿Y por qué cree que el presidente no ha podido lograr o vencer esta supuesta guerra económica hasta ahora?
Mira, no sabía decir. Así.
Sunday's vote was disputed from the start. It was called by the country's Constituent Assembly, which Maduro introduced last year, and has the power to overrule the opposition-dominated National Assembly. The country's popularly elected lawmakers are becoming even more powerless. Just a week before the election, the military banned journalists from the National Assembly.
The deputies are trying to let us in, but the soldiers are blocking our way.
Constituyente es un fraude, es una mentira. El único órgano legítimo que ejerce la soberanía popular es la Asamblea Nacional, electa por 14 millones de venezolanos, y hoy no se quiere que los venezolanos sepan de lo que estamos haciendo aquí para que haya democracia.
This election caught the opposition at its weakest. Their most popular leaders are in jail or in exile, and political parties were split over whether to vote or abstain. After last year's deadly street protest failed to bring down Maduro, the opposition lost momentum.
Did you expect more people to arrive today?
Not at all, not at all. We are conscious that there is fear in the air. We're conscious that people have wounds that were made last year and that still are very fresh. Many people were injured, many people were in prison, and that's something that it's not easy to forget. We're trying to regain the confidence.
Henry Falcón, a former ally of the late Hugo Chavez, had ignored the boycott, breaking ranks with the opposition coalition to challenge Maduro. He's now crying foul and calling for a rematch.
Para nosotros no hubo elecciones. Hay que hacer nuevas elecciones en Venezuela.
So what now for a president whose mandate is based on only 1/4 of eligible votes? Much of the international community has refused to recognize the results, and some in Venezuela are urging even tougher action.
A criminal trial for corruption against Maduro, to go ahead with stronger sanctions against those that have committed severe violations to human rights and corruption, as well as their front men. And certainly I want to see at the OAS, the Organization of American States, I want the European Union to be supportive of those of the sanctions that have been taken by other countries, and then move ahead in some more.
Others worry that turning up the heat on Maduro might backfire.
How is going to be the economy? Worse. And we are going to have a worse hyperinflation. And Maduro is going to be more repressive, which is what we are expecting now. Because in order to avoid any implosion or actions inside against him, he is going to be more and more radical.
Maduro has promised to deepen his socialist revolution, and to his supporters, it means preserving the legacy of late leader Hugo Chavez. Though many others fear Venezuela is about to see an era of greater confrontation, isolation, and unprecedented misery. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers, Caracas.
Joining us now from Washington is a former Venezuelan congressman, Leopoldo Martinez. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, an analyst for the International Crisis Group. And in Rome, Javier Farque is there. He's a journalist who specializes in Latin American affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. Leopoldo, can I start with you? Let's first talk about the electoral process itself and the result. What about the legitimacy of this result as far as you see it?
It's very difficult to call this a legitimate process. To begin, it was called by an institution that it's been already challenged under the Constitution and by the international community, the National Constitutional Assembly. And secondly, you have to think about the following factors. Major political opposition parties were proscribed. Key leaders of the opposition are either in prison or disqualified without due process of law. And most importantly, yesterday, during the election, the government coerced people to vote in this election through the intimidation that they would lose the so-called carnet de la patria. Millions of Venezuelans have only access to the benefits, the social benefits that they are entitled under the law through this government-issued card, and they had to show it in order to be eligible to receive those benefits before voting. So there was a transactional process there. Nonetheless, this whole tempered result, Maduro has received the lowest voting support ever in the last 20 years of any process in which Chavismo has assisted either on presidential elections or elections of other sort. 15 million people hold the Carnet de la Patria, and the government claims that more than 6 million are registered. Yet Maduro not able to show more than 5.8 million votes in support to his re-election bid.
Okay.
So that's the reason why the opposition split it over whether to participate and support Henry Falcón and others or to boycott the process. And the combined effect of all these two currents of opinion that exist in Venezuela show that there is a very significant reason to believe this is an illegitimate election.
Okay, we will pick up on many of the points you've made there, Leopoldo. But first of all, Javier Farque, as far as you're concerned, is it a legitimate result?
Yes, it is legitimate. I don't see how it cannot be legitimate. First of all, the opposition wanted the government to postpone the elections from April the 22nd to May the 20th, and the government duly obliged. If they did not think it was legitimate, why did they ask for the postponement? Why did they, part of the opposition, decided to take part? Now, the opposition is not divided because of Maduro, it's divided because of their own incoherence, their own disagreements within a wide range of political parties that come from the far right to the far left. Yes, the Chavismo has lost votes. There's no question about that. The fixed constituency of the Chavismo is usually 6 million votes, and they got this time 5.8 million, which is they have lost 200,000 because of the economic crisis. And people within the people who support the Chavismo are fed up and are tired, and therefore they didn't vote for Mr. Maduro. But they did not lose more than 200,000 votes of the usual constituency of 6 million votes that the Chavismo has had for the last 5, 6, 7 years. In relation to the opposition, if the opposition had presented a united front to fight the election, they would have had a better chance to fight for a better result. They are divided. They don't have a plan for the future of Venezuela. Some of the opposition want to bring down the government. Other people think that they should take part in the elections. Sometimes they take part. When they take part and they lose, they claim fraud. I mean, the problem for Venezuela is not so much. It's not only the problems that Maduro may have caused, which I agree that the economy is an absolute mess, but the opposition has not offered a valid alternative. The votes that Mr. Falcón, the opposition got, they did not get are the votes that should have come from the opposition. He lost those votes because the opposition decided not to support him. And I'm trying to understand how is it that an election, which is a chance to fight back against the Maduro government, was not taken advantage of by an opposition which is divided, which is split, and doesn't have a clue on an alternative for the future of Venezuela. Every country, every democracy needs a solid, strong opposition, and Venezuela lacks that, and that is a problem for Venezuela at the moment.
Okay, we will definitely put that point to Leopoldo, but first of all, Phil Gunson, Leopoldo mentioned this Carnet de la Patria, the fatherland card, and the government had said to people, after you voted, come and scan your Carnet de la Patria in a red tent, which were these government set-up tents. There were 13,000 of them around Venezuela. Scan one and you'll get a prize, as promised by the president. Now, that's a little bit strange in a democracy, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of the votes that were cast yesterday were presumably cast because of promises like that, or more particularly because, and I think Leopoldo mentioned this, that many people were afraid that if they didn't scan their cards, then they would lose benefits, most particularly, of course, food, which is critically scarce in Venezuela at the moment. And the government makes repeated and very explicit references to the fact that the card, the Carnet de la Patria, and the code that's on it make it possible through the scanning machine for the government to know in each individual case which benefits you're receiving. And then they link that specifically to the voting process, saying when you come to vote, make sure you scan your card. It doesn't take a great deal of scientific thought, let's say, to make the connection that that the threat there, at least implicit, is that you will lose your benefits if you don't go to vote. And it's also backed up by the fact that there have been many people who've lost their jobs. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, who've lost their jobs over recent years because they were deemed to be opposition supporters. I'm talking about jobs, obviously, in the public sector. And people who've even been thrown out, for example, of public housing or threatened with being thrown out of public housing because they're regarded for one reason or another as not sufficiently loyal to the government.
Okay, so one more question about the electoral process itself. Leopoldo, Javier Farge says that people were upset, or the opposition was upset, and therefore didn't run in the election. And while fully understanding that many opposition leaders weren't actually able to run for various reasons, which we'll get into, is it not true that many voters in Venezuela are actually unhappy with the opposition for this boycott because they wanted their opportunity to possibly vote for someone who's not Maduro?
Well, the immense majority of Venezuelans are in opposition to the regime. However, tactically, there was a split in the core constituencies of the opposition because many believed that this election was going to be, as it ended up being, tainted or tampered by the government. What has been said by me and others here in the panel, it's absolutely true. Votes were basically bought by the government through the Carnet de la Patria or coerced people to vote.
Yeah, Leopoldo, sorry, we've gone through that. That doesn't answer the question about why there was this mass boycott by the main opposition bloc, because people have said in Venezuela, we wanted you to stand, we wanted to vote for you, but you haven't given us the chance.
Because the government did everything possible to make this election unacceptable to a very significant portion of the population. That's the game they're playing. The game they're playing is it's proposing these electoral processes in a way that are absolutely unacceptable to a significant part of Venezuela's population. It's not because of the lack of interest in the opposition to come in a united front. It's because the government creates this system that generates massive distrust in the institutions. And that's how they play this game. However, you also have to know that you do have political parties, opposition political parties, that have been proscribed. They had been banned from participating in this election month before the election. So this is a factor that it's rather unusual in a democracy as well. Not to mention that Enrique Capriles is disqualified to run for office, Leopoldo Lopez remains in prison, and many others are also in prison without due process of law. So this creates a tremendous amount of visions around the electorate on how to proceed in this confrontation with the government. But I must say that it is also important to note that this election was illegal in its origin, because under the Constitution, this election must have been held by the end of this year to re-elect or not Maduro for a 6th term in office. However, the Constitutional National Assembly was superposed to the whole institutional framework, and they precipitated this election at the time that was most convenient for the government to hold the election, and also by establishing all these conditions that made it difficult for the opposition to come in a unified front, as it should have.
Leopoldo, I like you. You keep taking the discussion forward to where I'm about to take it. Thank you very much for that. But let's just go back one step, Javier Farge. This point of Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo Lopez, Antonio Ledesma, Ramon Muchacho, David Smolansky, just to name some political leaders who have been barred from running for the offices that they would like to on the ballot paper. This is another strange issue going on with the Maduro government.
There is evidence that Leopoldo Lopez and Ledesma and other leaders of the opposition were involved in promoting violence in the streets of Venezuela. I was there when the violence was happening, and I saw it with my own eyes. Leopoldo Lopez was heavily involved in promoting violence in the streets of Venezuela. Not peaceful protest, violence. And there's plenty of graphic evidence that he was involved in this kind of violence. By the way, Leopoldo Lopez's family is, renowned for having supported every coup in the 20th century. But I agree that some of the leaders should have been let out. In the Carnet de la Patria, I'm not saying that that's not the case, that they have used the Carnet de la Patria to manipulate people. I would like to see more evidence. But if that is the case, that is wrong, and I'm not going to endorse that. Definitely not. In relation to the elections, The opposition, I said it before, the opposition asked the government to postpone the election which had been called for the 22nd of April, the opposition, the whole opposition, to postpone them. The government duly obliged. When they decided to carry on the opposition, the elections on the 20th of May, the opposition decided to abandon the talks in the Dominican Republic. Why? If they were not considering these elections legitimate, why did they ask for the postponing of the elections?
Because the elections were not on the talks or the negotiation process, Javier. That the elections were provided under the Constitution to happen just a few months before January of this year, not when the government wanted them to happen.
According to the Constitution, the Bolivarian Constitution, the elections can be called by the executive power or by the assembly.
Okay, I tell you what, gentlemen.
Now, hang on, listen.
Let's need to be called 6 months before the date in which.
Listen, I'm going to have to interrupt both of you, okay, because we only have a few minutes. There's much more to discuss. We only have a few minutes. I want to address the democratic principles that people say Maduro does not adhere to. Phil Gunson. He creates this new chamber of lawmakers, this new assembly, because he, Maduro, loses power in the National Assembly. And then the new Constituent Assembly is full of pro-government supporters. That, again, seems like an anti-democratic act. What do you make of that?
The National Constituent Assembly that was elected in July last year does consist entirely of supporters of the government because the opposition boycotted that election. The reason why they boycotted it, well, there were two main reasons, I think, why they boycotted it. One was that the president under the Constitution can't actually convene an election, call an election for a Constituent Assembly. That has to be done primarily by the electorate. There should have been a prior referendum, or there should have been a petition that came from the electorate in order for the president to trigger that process. But perhaps more importantly, the whole voting process for that Constituent Assembly was rigged in the sense that there was no one man, one person, one vote. There were some electors, some voters who had 2 votes because they had what they called a territorial vote in their local municipality, and because they belonged to certain arbitrarily designated sectors like disabled people or indigenous people, they had another vote as well. The opposition regarded that as a completely spurious election, and they boycotted it. The National Constituent Assembly, according to the government, is now sovereign. It can do anything it likes. It even had Falcon, for example, been elected president in this yesterday, in the presidential election yesterday, the Constituent Assembly could have immediately voted to amend the Constitution to curtail the powers of the presidency. So this is a body which answers to Maduro. It's, as you say, a way of bypassing the National Assembly, the country's parliament, which is dominated by the opposition and which was freely and fairly elected by 14 million Venezuelans back in 2015. So that's a major reason why the international community, as well as the Venezuelan opposition, regards this whole election process as spurious. And 14 countries this morning have said that they're going to pull their ambassadors, at least recall their ambassadors from Caracas for consultations, because this is not a legitimate process.
What happens in the next 6 years, Javier Farque? Crime rates are up. Annual inflation is anywhere between 13,000 to 18,000% a year because it's changing so wildly. The crisis has produced the biggest migration of people in Latin America in modern times. How much is this Maduro's fault? How much is he going to be able to correct it? Briefly, please, Javier.
Yes. Yeah, sure. First of all, the Constitution says that the president and the executive powers and communities can call for a Constituent Assembly. So anyone could have done that. But anyway, first of all, yes, there's been a great deal of mismanagement of the economy. There's an economic blockade against Venezuela. Venezuela is not allowed to pay money for the medicines that have been importing from labs all over the world. Second, it is has a great deal to do with mismanagement of the economy and corruption, no question about that, but also the low prices of oil in the international markets. By the way, there's more Colombians, there were at some point more Colombians living in Venezuela than Venezuelans living to Colombia. So I'm not really sure whether the figures about the biggest immigration is correct, but I might be wrong. I'm not really going to discuss that. What is the solution? Dialogue between the opposition and the government. Maduro is going to stay there, whether you like it or not. I might not like it, I might like it. It's good to be, and he's called for a new dialogue to restart the negotiation between the opposition and the government to reach certain agreements to prevent the escalation of violence, because there could be more violence. What do you expect in Venezuela if there is no dialogue? A civil war, and that cannot be the best solution for Venezuela. So whether you like it or not, whether you like the result or not, I think there should be a dialogue, there should be an independent opposition that should sit down and talk to the government. They are perfectly entitled to abandon the talks if they believe that the government is not listening to them. Also, at the same time, the Venezuelan people have told Maduro, look, some of us support you, millions of us support you, but we are prepared to take away the votes from you if you don't change the situation.
Okay,
so Maduro
Javier,
has got a lesson as well.
Please, we have run out of time, but I want to give the last word to Leopoldo, and please, Leopoldo, be brief. Is Maduro going to survive his entire 6-year term, or is he going to be removed from within or possibly even from without?
I doubt that the circumstances as they are will permit Maduro to continue in the presidency without a significant challenge from within. He's weak. He is really weak, and his own supporters and the leaders of the coalition that upholds him in power know that. And of course, the circumstances in the economy, which are continue to deteriorate and have grave social implications, have nothing to do with international sanctions, which are normally individual sanctions targeted to the officers that had perpetrated human rights abuses. It's the mismanagement of the economy, the collapse in the oil prices, but also the collapse of private sector in Venezuela, because mostly the private sector had been either expropriated or subjected to conditions under which no one can produce. So this is just very difficult to imagine how it would sustain itself without significant oppression of the Venezuelan people, because I want to just state something very important. There is no possibility of violence coming from the opposition. The government is in control of the military, in total control of the military, and repression starts there. And that's what happened in the streets every time there are protests. The government comes with deadly force against protesters, and in one or another event, they get a rock from the protesters or something like that. But it's because the massive oppression of the regime that will continue unless from within there is some sort of reflection about the results that happened yesterday and the initiation of a different process to find common ground in Venezuela.
Leopoldo Martinez, Phil Gunson, Javier Farque, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Coming up on the Newsmakers, is the British royal family breaking the bank, or are they the country's cash cow? And we break down Pakistan's alleged support of the Afghan Taliban with journalist and author Steve Coll. You may have heard there was a wedding over the weekend. 100,000 people crammed around Windsor Castle to catch a glimpse of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But beyond the pomp and circumstance are critics of the Crown scoffing at the taxpayer being asked to contribute $42 million towards the staging of the royal wedding. Republicans say enough is enough for what are basically ceremonial positions. But many retailers are still chanting, "Long live the Queen." The royal family is a massive draw card for tourists. Queen Elizabeth herself has become a billion-dollar brand for British-made goods. But is that enough to justify the centuries-old institution? Shoaib Hassan has more.
A glittering affair celebrated across the globe. That's how fans of royalty will want to remember the wedding of Britain's Prince Harry and American actress Meghan Markle. As celebrities like Oprah Winfrey and David Beckham joined the royal family in the festivities, thousands of people lined the streets of Windsor for a glimpse of the newlyweds. But not the entire kingdom was united in such joy. Critics of the monarchy also came out in force, such as Emma Dent-Coad, Labour MP from London's Kensington Borough, where a royal residence is located. She wrote, "I have no interest in the royal wedding and won't be shamed into silence." Coll added that monarchy in the modern world is, quote, "anti-democratic and non-constitutional." She also asked, why do we support them with our taxes? The wedding for the new Duke and Duchess of Sussex cost almost $43 million. The royal family paid $3 million, while the remaining $40 million, or 94%, will be borne by the UK taxpayer. That's quite a hefty increase on the $27 million they paid for the wedding of Harry's elder brother, Prince William, in 2011. And the amounts in addition to the $470 million of taxpayer money spent on the royals every year.
Well, I think all the money that's spent on that kind of thing is suspect, really. If you're talking about spending taxpayers' money, you know, everybody has the right to life and to earn money. Lots of young people are finding it very difficult to get somewhere to live, let alone get a wedding.
This kind of skepticism seems to be on the increase. A poll on the eve of the wedding had more than half of Britons saying they wouldn't be tuning in to watch the spectacle. So, as the confetti settles, could Britain reconsider what it spends on its royal family? And is it time to rethink the centuries-old institution entirely? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Let's get the views now of Queen Elizabeth's former press secretary, Dickie Arbiter, and also the leader of the UK's Democratic Republican Party, who is Peter Kello. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Dickie, 1,000 years of tradition, is that reason alone to continue with the royal family in the UK?
It's plenty of reason to continue with the monarchy in the UK. If you look around the world, you get executive presidents and ceremonial presidents. You can think twice about some of the executive presidents. I mean, look at the United States, for example, in complete disarray politically, and likely to be in more disarray once we have the midterm elections and the House of Representatives and Congress changes its colour. The monarchy is a stabilising influence when it comes to parliamentary democracy, and it has worked for 1,000 years, and it will continue working.
Well, Peter, if we're talking about politics, Dickie's brought it immediately to politics. The Queen, any monarch of the UK, is an unelected head of state. So does that work for most people in the country?
The monarch, just by being there, has a huge effect on British politics. The fact that we've got a monarchy means that there's a whole load of different agendas that we can't pursue that are broadly Republican agendas. Without going into detail, one of the great advantages of a republic is that it generates a kind of flywheel effect. Because decisions are made by different parties, in order for decisions to be made, it's rather more cumbersome. But once they're in place, they just keep on going. Whereas we have a system which is where it's much more orientated to democracy, because the head of state effectively doesn't nominally participate, but the fact that she's there means that we have a certain way of making decisions, which is absolutely fundamental.
But we do have a system, it's called an election.
Carry on, Peter.
We have an election, yes, but there's far more to a Republican constitution than just the election. I mean, in this country, we have this very, very simplified idea of what politics is about. We keep banging the drum for democracy, just as they do in the United States. But actually, there's far more to a mature government and a mature republic than just democracy. If you take France, for instance, France is able to make long-term decisions to build the TGV railway, for instance. It takes long-term decisions about industry. It's very difficult to do that in this country. Because we don't have a Republican structure, it means everything is at the whim of the elected, democratically elected MPs. And this has a very bad effect. You've seen the mess that we've got into about deciding whether we're going to have high-speed 2. Personally, I'm not quite sure whether it's go or stop at the moment, but it just gets kicked around as a political football, whereas in a republic,
you're kind of muddying. You're muddying the waters here.
No, Dickie, listen, I really want to move on from this. Okay, I think Peter's made his point, and I'm afraid I really want to address to you, Dickie, a very fundamental philosophical issue about every monarchy in the world. So let's apply it to the one that we're talking about now. It's a question of the world becoming more meritocratic. You know where I'm going with this. It's about the world becoming more democratic. And here we have, let's pick a child and call him Prince George. He's born into a family, which means that his status and his security in life is assured. He will never really have to get a proper job and have to justify himself to his employer to get a salary in return. Have we not moved on enough now, as we are in 2018, to do away with monarchies and live as complete meritocracies?
That is something for the politicians to decide. That is something for the people to decide. Politicians go to the ballot box. Politicians put out a policy and say, we want to abolish the monarchy, and the people vote accordingly. You either do it from a referendum or you do it through a general election. You cannot blame the monarchy for being in the position that it's in, because it doesn't have any power. It has right of succession. As you say, Prince George, very small now. One day he will become king. That's the way our constitution works. If people want to change, then they must say we want to change. If politicians want to change, they must say we want to change. They are the ones that govern the country. They are the ones that make the political decision. If Republicans want to change, then get yourselves voted into Parliament and rattle a few cages. Get yourself heard in Parliament on the platform of democracy. Rattling around in the street or on television programs is not actually going to get you anywhere. And until such time there's change, we live with a monarchy, as does Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, Spain. They're all in exactly the same bait. The people want a monarchy. If they want change, vote for a change.
Okay, well, you know, we live in a world of adulation of celebrity, and the royal family are celebrities. So whether that happens or not, we will have to wait and see. But Peter, can I give you another sociological issue here? Okay, because YouGov did a poll exclusively for Britons before this royal wedding over the weekend. And it found that monarchists are slightly more likely to have voted leave in the Brexit referendum. In other words, exit the European Union. They're the biggest supporters of the monarchy in terms of those who are over 55 years old. They're more likely to support the UK having nuclear weapons, and significantly more likely to support tightening immigration restrictions. Those details all paint a certain picture of the kind of person that supports a monarchy, whether you like that picture or not. But I can tell you also, YouGov found that the least amount of support for the monarchy was among 18 to 24-year-olds. What does that all say to you?
I think what it indicates is that there is a desire in the population for sovereign independence. All the issues you mentioned about Brexit, which incidentally I would fully support, tend to be issues that go with issues that go with people who are really interested in the nation state, who are not interested in these legalistic relationships with other countries throughout the world, such as the EU, such as NATO, such as the Bank for International Settlements. All these structures take away authority and take away sovereignty of the country. And I am fully agreeing with that kind of view. And yes, I can imagine that people would say, well, the idea of the independent monarchy fits in with that scenario. To a degree, they are right, it does. But on the other hand, I think that we need to get a broader perspective and see that we can have those virtues, we can have the virtues of sovereignty, and the monarch doesn't really give us those things. It may suggest a kind of independence because of the symbolism that is always referred to, but it's really very hollow. What we would like to do in the party is create a far deeper kind of national settlement. The monarchy, when it comes down to it, it's just hollow. And everything that Mr. Arbiter says, it's hollow. It's just all surface. It's been there for 1,000 years. It's all surface. It's not giving the country the real heart that it needs in order to face up to the problems of the world today. And I think that what you have discovered from the YouGov survey rather indicates that that's what people want. But the monarchy is not the clue to having that.
Okay, Peter, while respecting your opinion, I'm going to close this interview by thanking both you and Dickie by telling you that YouGov poll found that 69% of respondents were monarchists. That kind of speaks for itself in a way. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. The Afghan Taliban is warning people in Kabul to stay away from military centres, promising a new wave of attacks. Sadly, that headline is not really breaking news anymore. Afghanistan has seen more than 16 years of bloodshed in what was initially promised by Washington as a war on terror that would stamp out Taliban forces for good. New insight into what's gone wrong in those efforts has come out in the book Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The book's author is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Steve Coll, who joins us now from New York. Steve, thank you very much indeed for your time. Can we go back in history, first of all, and look at how possibly and what role the United States may have played, perhaps even unwittingly, in the creation of the Taliban in terms of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet invaders, the Soviets being defeated, and then how the Mujahideen morphed into the Taliban?
Well, the CIA collaborated with Pakistan's intelligence service during the 1980s, as you say, to build up the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But in that collaboration, the CIA let the Pakistanis choose which militias were most favored, and the Pakistanis, for their own reason, tended to favor extremist groups, particularly those around Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. After the Soviets withdrew, as you point out, the Mujahideen fell into a civil war, partly along ethnic lines, partly along ideological lines. And it was out of that chaos that the Taliban rose. Now, it's debated as to whether they were always an ISI Pakistani creation or whether they were seized upon by the ISI fairly quickly after they emerged. But there's no doubt that they became a creature of Pakistani intelligence during the mid-1990s. By that time, the United States had left Afghanistan, but it was this policy of allowing the Pakistanis to favor extremist groups that I think fed into the Taliban's rise.
Do you think the US also possibly took its eye off the ball when the Taliban were emerging as the dominant force in Afghanistan, and then when they came to power, and then when they were harboring, even working with Osama bin Laden?
Yeah, certainly in the early 1990s, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan altogether, despite its contributions to the Civil War and to the violence that had unfolded during the 1980s. The United States essentially abandoned the country and left Pakistan holding the difficulties of cross-border violence, of guns, heroin addiction, large refugee population. And when the Taliban emerged, the United States still remained barely a factor in Afghanistan, providing some humanitarian aid, but not really challenging the Taliban's extremist rule. Now, when Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda found shelter in Afghanistan starting in 1996, and when they began to carry out overseas attacks, for example, against 2 U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998, at that point, the CIA did get back involved trying to find ways to thwart al-Qaeda and bin Laden. However, the policy was just to concentrate on international terrorism and not to really deal with the realities of poverty and brutal rule by the Taliban in Afghanistan. It was as if al-Qaeda and terrorism could be isolated from the broader problems of Afghanistan, and that proved to be a misreading of the situation.
So how much of a role has Pakistan played in propping up the Taliban since it was removed from power in 2001?
Well, initially in 2001, after the September 11th attacks, the Pakistan army, led then by Pervez Musharraf, did decide to abandon the Taliban to its fate and switch sides, essentially, joining the US-led coalition. But they did so reluctantly and under pressure, feeling they had no real choice. And after the Taliban fell, Pakistan right away believed that the new government in Afghanistan was unfriendly, too unfriendly to Pakistan to be acceptable. But it didn't immediately move to revive the Taliban. It was only really 2003, 2004, after the new Afghan government had consolidated its position with successful elections and a negotiated new constitution, And also the United States started to signal that it was again leaving Afghanistan, going off now to fight a troubled and increasingly deteriorating war in Iraq. At that point, I think the Pakistani generals said to themselves, well, we're left again to our own devices. We have to prosecute our own interests, and the Taliban comeback began. By 2006, I think there's evidence that the Pakistani government had made a full-throated decision to support the Taliban's comeback. And indeed, by that time, by 2006, the Taliban constituted a full-strength insurgency in many parts of Afghanistan, particularly in the south and east.
So, Steve, we're talking a lot about governments at the moment. There's an element here which, of course, you concentrate very heavily on in your book, the ISI intelligence agency in Pakistan. How independent is that of the Pakistani government? And have you found a smoking gun? Is it in the book that shows the link between the ISI and the Afghan Taliban?
Well, there's no real doubt about links between the ISI and the Afghan Taliban. It's lying in plain sight. The Afghan leadership, the Taliban leadership lives in Pakistan. They receive medical care. They go back and forth from Pakistan to Afghanistan unmolested. They're not being arrested. The Pakistan government would say, well, we can't locate them. We don't know where they are. But I don't think anyone regards that as a credible claim overall. But you ask an important question: how much does this really express top-down Pakistani state policy, and how much of it is them trying to ride the tiger of an insurgent group that they can't always control? There are certainly elements of both at play. ISI is a creature of the Pakistan military. It's commanded by a three-star general. It reports directly to the head of the army. It's not a rogue organization. But down in its ranks, there are contractors and independent allies. And of course, this is all constructed, just as intelligence services do elsewhere in the world, to create deniability, to provide the Pakistani state with some space to say, well, that's not really our terrorist attack. We can't control these groups. And the Pakistani state is not, a monster. It's not an all-powerful entity. It has its own sources of weakness and corruption that prevent it from controlling everything that goes on in its system. But there's plenty of evidence, both in the open sources, for example, around the Mumbai attack, and in other kinds of channels that show direct collaboration between Pakistani retired army officers and groups on very ambitious terrorist strikes.
I'd like you to give us an illustration of the mess that Afghanistan is at the moment, and therefore the challenges that American intelligence agencies, even Pakistani intelligence agencies, who may have different aims, as we're discussing in Afghanistan, but the challenges they may face in Afghanistan. Can you recount that story that's in your book about the suicide bomber that went to say goodbye to his family? I think that's a good illustration of the situation in Afghanistan.
Well, I think you're referring to a chapter that describes how American intelligence and, to some extent, the Pakistan Army operating in Waziristan tried to get a grip on who these suicide bombers, who seemed to be inspired by tactics in the Iraq War, who they really were, and how they were being persuaded to take their own young lives in the cause of the Taliban's revolution. And one of the patterns that these investigators discovered was that the bombers themselves were often very young and very naive and poorly trained, and an example, and that they would often detonate themselves before they had really reached their target. You had 14, 15-year-old boys being asked to drive cars at high speeds and crash into military convoys, having never driven a car before, and of course, under the most intense psychological pressure that it's possible to imagine. They were also being drugged in some cases and given sedatives of various kinds. The story you referred to is a young man who went to say goodbye to his parents before seeking martyrdom and accidentally detonated himself in their company, killing himself and his parents. But it was a sad picture of cynical ideological manipulation by some of these groups, and young men who didn't have the social or political kind of power to resist the role that they were being asked to play, sometimes even by their own families.
Is Afghanistan a failed state? And if you answer in the affirmative, Is that because of outside interference or because of domestic incompetence?
Well, Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1979 and has more or less been at war ever since. It was not a war that was caused by internal fracturing. It was a war that was started by an outside invasion, and ever since, Afghanistan's violence has been shaped by both outside interference and internal conflict and incompetency. Afghanistan is not a failed state in the sense that there is an Afghan nation that lived at peace with itself and its neighbors through most of the 20th century, and that continues to try to resurrect itself despite the enormous pressures of violence and cross-border interference in Afghanistan's conflicts from Pakistan, as well as from the rest of the international community, which has overloaded Afghanistan with aid and fostered corruption through, short-sighted policies. But is Afghanistan a failed state? It's a failing state that is being propped up by international subsidy and international support. It has, like a lot of other poor countries, required international assistance just to pay its budget for many decades. But there's still a strong sense of nationalism. There's a generation that's come of age in the cities in Afghanistan since 2001. It's very plugged into the world, very determined, very resilient. It's remarkable that Afghanistan puts up with the failures of policy that it has had to endure from the United States and the international community. And part of what that shows, I think, is a strong desire among the great majority of Afghanistans to have their country back and to end this war that is often fueled across the border from Pakistan that they face against the Taliban.
Steve Coll, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Do check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Malaysia's recently deposed Prime Minister could soon be heading to jail. Is this justice or political payback? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.